He faked paralysis to test her wife, but I'm the maid who showed the millionaire what true care feels like. They say he faked his paralysis just to test his wife's love, but let me tell you, he never imagined the truth I'd reveal, the care I would actually give, the love I had in silence all those years. Maybe you're working for someone who never says thank you or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I promise today's story will touch your heart. I'm Rosa Martinez, 58 years old with hands that tell stories, weathered by decades of scrubbing marble floors, polishing crystal until it sparkled like diamonds, and folding silk sheets that cost more than most people make in a month. My uniform was always the same, a navy blue dress with white trim, starched to perfection, smelling of the lavender detergent I used on everything in that Manhattan penthouse. Every morning at 5:30, I'd step out into the bitter New York air, watching the city wake up around me. Yellow taxis honking through empty streets, steam rising from manholes, the distant hum of Wall Street preparing for another day of making millions. The Harrington penthouse sat 40 floors above Central Park, all glass and marble and money. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from ceilings so high, they made you feel small, just looking up. The kitchen alone was bigger than the apartment I shared with 3 other women in Queens. Italian marble countertops, German appliances, French wine that cost more than my monthly salary sitting in temperature-controlled cabinets. This was wealth beyond imagination, the kind that came from generations of smart investments, stock market victories, and what Mr. Harrington called playing the game better than everyone else. But no amount of sparkle ever reached the corners of my own life. While I polished their world to perfection, mine felt empty and cold. I'd been working for the Harringtons for 9 years, 9 months and 12 days. I counted because each day felt like a small eternity of invisible service. I raised their twin boys, Marcus and David, while my own daughter Carmen grew up 2,000 miles away in San Juan, surrounded by my sister's family instead of her mother's love. That October evening changed everything. I was folding laundry in the master bedroom, sheets so fine they felt like silk between my fingers, when my phone buzzed. Carmen had sent me a video from her school's talent show. She was singing, her voice pure and beautiful, wearing a dress I'd never seen before. My sister Maria had bought it for her. I watched my daughter bow to applause I couldn't hear, surrounded by proud parents I wasn't there to stand beside. The phone slipped from my hands, clattering onto the marble floor. The sound echoed in the enormous room like a gunshot. "Everything all right up there, Rosa?" Mrs. Harrington's voice drifted up from downstairs, sharp with annoyance rather than concern. I had begged for time off for that show. Begged. I'd saved money for months to buy a plane ticket, planned to surprise Carmen. But Mr. Harrington was launching a new cryptocurrency venture, hosting investors who needed to see perfection in every corner of his home. "We need you here, Rosa," Mrs. Janty Harrington had said, not even looking up from her phone. "The master requires assistance. You understand." I understood. I understood that my daughter's childhood was passing me by, one missed moment at a time. I understood that while I was ironing other people's memories into perfect creases, my own life was wrinkling beyond repair. For 9 years, I had been their shadow. I knew every creak of the hardwood floors, every temperamental setting on the 6-burner gas range, every preference and quirk of a family that treated me like expensive furniture. Necessary, well-maintained, but ultimately invisible. I woke before them, slept after them, and spent every waking hour in between making their lives effortless. When Mrs. Harrington complained that the roses in the foyer weren't arranged properly, I'd spend an hour perfecting them. When Mr. Harrington needed his pills organized just so, I'd count them out like a pharmacist. When the twins tracked mud through the entryway, I'd clean it without a sigh, even though they never learned to wipe their feet. "You're lucky to have a roof over your head," Mrs. Harrington would say whenever I mentioned my own apartment, my own bills, my own life existing somewhere beyond their marble walls. Lucky. As if serving them was a privilege I should be grateful for, not work I was being paid to do. The words cut deeper each time, like paper cuts that never quite healed. I sent every spare dollar home to Puerto Rico. While they spent thousands on wine that would sit in their cellar for years, I survived on rice and beans, eating standing up in their kitchen because the help wasn't supposed to use the dining room. I'd grown thin over the years. Not from vanity, but from sacrifice. Every pound I lost meant another $20 I could send to Carmen, another small luxury I could give the daughter I was raising from a distance. The microaggressions came in waves, small and sharp and relentless. My paychecks arrived late more often than not. Oh, did I forget? It's been such a busy week, Mrs. Harrington would say with a smile that never reached her eyes. When something went missing or broke, the first assumption was always that I had been careless, even after 9 years of perfect service. Mrs. Harrington's sister Victoria visited once and made pointed comments about how the help was getting too comfortable, too familiar. She watched me like I was planning to steal the silver, her suspicious eyes following my every movement. The winter I got bronchitis. I worked through it because there was no one else to maintain their standard of perfection. I cleaned their floors while my chest ached, polished their mirrors while my vision blurred with fever, served their dinner parties while I could barely catch my breath. No one noticed, or if they did, no one cared enough to tell me to rest. The show had to go on, and I was just another prop in their performance of wealth and success. One evening in February, while dusting the mantelpiece in their living room, my hands were shaking so badly from exhaustion that I knocked over a crystal vase. It shattered against the marble floor with a sound like breaking promises. I stood there staring at the pieces, seeing my reflection multiplied and distorted in each shard. On the wall above, their family portraits smiled down at me, formal poses in expensive clothes, the kind of pictures that end up in society magazines. I wasn't in any of them, despite being more present in their daily lives than any relative or friend. What would happen if I just walked away? I whispered to the empty room. The thought terrified and thrilled me in equal measure, but fear won, as it always did. Fear of unemployment, of losing my visa status, of disappointing Carmen who depended on the money I sent home. So I swept up the glass and pretended the moment of rebellion had never happened. That night, I pulled out the suitcase I kept under my bed. I'd bought it years ago, thinking I might visit Carmen for Christmas. But Christmas came and went, and the suitcase stayed empty. I couldn't bring myself to pack it or to put it away. It sat there like a promise I couldn't keep, a dream I couldn't abandon. I touched the handle but didn't lift it. Not yet. The shift began slowly, like winter ice starting to crack. I stopped staying late without being asked. I took my full lunch breaks instead of eating quickly and getting back to work. Small rebellions that felt enormous to me. Mrs. Harrington noticed immediately. Her smiles became tighter, her requests more pointed. "You seem distant lately, Rosa. Is everything all right? We depend on you so much." Depend on me, yes, but appreciate me? That was different. Their grown children visited for Easter weekend, Marcus and David, now 25 and successful in their own right. Marcus worked in finance, cryptocurrency investments and blockchain technology, following in his father's footsteps. David was in real estate. Buying and selling Manhattan properties worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. I'd helped raise these boys, bandaged their scraped knees, made their favorite grilled cheese sandwiches, listened to their childhood fears and dreams. But when they looked at me now, I saw the same polite distance I got from their parents. "Why are you being so cold?" David asked when I didn't immediately jump to refill his coffee cup. Cold. As if my years of invisible warmth entitled him to unlimited service forever. I found solace in unexpected places. Mrs. Chen, the building's night security guard, had become a quiet friend over the years. She worked 12-hour shifts, just like me, keeping watch over the wealthy while living in a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn. We'd share coffee sometimes in the building's service elevator. Two invisible women holding up other people's perfect lives. "You look tired, Rosa," she'd say with genuine concern. "When's the last time you did something just for you?" The question haunted me because I couldn't remember the answer. Everything changed the morning I found Mr. Harrington collapsed in his study. It was a Tuesday in March, and I'd come in early to prepare for another of their dinner parties. He was lying beside his desk, moaning about his legs, his back, claiming he couldn't move. Mrs. Harrington was hysterical, calling doctors and lawyers and publicists in a frenzy of panic and calculation. "It must have been the stress," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "All those cryptocurrency investments, the pressure of managing such a vast fortune. Henry works too hard." The ambulance came and went. The doctors couldn't find anything definitively wrong, but they recommended rest, observation, physical therapy. Within a week, Mr. Harrington was in a wheelchair, claiming complete paralysis from the waist down. The whole routine of the house changed overnight. Suddenly, my job wasn't just cleaning and cooking, it was caregiving at a level I'd never experienced. Mrs. Harrington, for all her dramatic reactions to the crisis, proved surprisingly useless when it came to actual care. She'd flutter around him for a few minutes each day, straightening his blankets and making sympathetic sounds, but the real work fell to me, helping him dress, preparing special meals, managing his medications, assisting with physical therapy exercises, the intimate, patient work of caring for someone who couldn't care for himself. And here's what surprised me. I was good at it. More than good. I was gentle and thorough and intuitive in ways that seemed to comfort him. After a lifetime of polishing objects and cleaning spaces, suddenly I was caring for a human being who needed me in a way that went beyond keeping his marble floors spotless. The first time I helped him transfer from his bed to the wheelchair, his hands shook with what I thought was embarrassment. "I'm sorry you have to see me like this, Rosa," he said quietly. It was the first time in 9 years he'd spoken to me like I was a person instead of a service provider. "Don't apologize, Mr. Harrington," I replied. "Everyone needs help sometimes." But Mrs. Harrington's behavior during this crisis revealed something ugly. Within days of the diagnosis, she was making phone calls to lawyer friends, asking about insurance policies and disability benefits. She complained constantly about how the wheelchair was scratching the hardwood floors, how the medical equipment cluttered up their perfect aesthetic. When she thought I wasn't listening, I heard her on the phone with her sister. "I married him for better or worse, but nobody mentioned paralysis. I'm too young to be a nursemaid." The woman who had never lifted a finger to help with her own children's scraped knees was now faced with caring for her husband, and she was failing spectacularly. She'd bring him breakfast and leave it just out of reach. She'd promise to help with his exercises and then disappear to the spa. She'd host her book club in the living room while he was napping, their laughter and chatter filling the apartment with a cheerfulness that felt cruel. I watched all of this with growing unease. Something felt off about the whole situation, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Mr. Harrington's paralysis had come on suddenly with no clear medical cause. He was only 52, in good health otherwise. The doctors were puzzled but not alarmed. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, I caught glimpses of something. A foot that twitched when I was cleaning nearby. Eyes that tracked movement too precisely for someone supposedly numb from the waist down. But I pushed those observations aside. What did I know about medical conditions? I was just the housekeeper. My job was to help, not to question. The work was exhausting. My days now started at 5 and ended near midnight. In addition to all my regular duties, I was now managing medications, helping with personal care, adjusting furniture and equipment, preparing special meals. My back ached constantly from lifting and transferring. My hands were raw from the extra cleaning required by the medical equipment. I was earning the same salary but working twice as hard. And Mrs. Harrington? She had begun treating me with a new kind of dismissiveness, as if my expanded role somehow made me less significant rather than more valuable. "Rosa, make sure you're being gentle with him," she'd say in a tone that suggested I might be naturally rough or careless. "This is very delicate work. I hope you understand how important it is to do everything exactly right." 3 months into Mr. Harrington's condition, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was cleaning his study while he napped in his wheelchair nearby, organizing the papers on his desk that seemed to multiply daily. Business documents, investment reports, cryptocurrency portfolios worth millions of dollars. A letter had fallen behind the desk, and as I reached to retrieve it, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. It was a handwritten note in Mr. Harrington's distinctive scrawl, dated 2 weeks before his supposed accident. The letter was addressed to a private investigator, requesting surveillance of his wife's activities, her phone calls, her meetings with friends. He suspected she was having an affair and wanted evidence. The note ended with a chilling line: "I need to know who Catherine really is when she thinks no one is watching." My hands shook as I read those words. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Mr. Harrington wasn't paralyzed. He was conducting an elaborate test of his wife's loyalty and love. And I was an unwitting accomplice in his deception, providing the care that made his performance believable. I looked over at him, supposedly sleeping peacefully in his wheelchair. His breathing was too controlled, too perfect. Real sleep is messier, more vulnerable. This was the sleep of someone who was actively listening, actively performing even in unconsciousness. The betrayal I felt was overwhelming. Not just his betrayal of his wife, though that was enormous, but his betrayal of me. For 3 months, I had been pouring genuine care and compassion into what I thought was a medical crisis. I had worked myself to exhaustion, sacrificed what little free time I had, pushed my own health to the breaking point, all to care for someone who was lying to me every single day. But there was something else, something that surprised me even more than the anger. In those 3 months of caring for him, something had shifted in our relationship. The man I had served invisibly for 9 years had finally started seeing me as a person. He asked about my daughter, remembered details about my life, thanked me for small kindnesses. Even if it was built on a lie, it was the most human connection I'd had in that house. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back where I'd found it. For the first time in my life, I held power in that relationship. I knew something that could destroy him, destroy their marriage, destroy the careful image they projected to their wealthy social circle. The question was, what was I going to do with that knowledge? That evening, as I helped him into bed, he looked up at me with what seemed like genuine gratitude. "Rosa, I don't know what we would do without you, especially now. Catherine tries, but she doesn't have your touch, your patience." His words felt like glass in my throat. I wanted to shake him, to scream that I had been patient and caring for years before his fake paralysis, that I had been invisible and taken for granted despite giving everything I had to give. But instead, I simply said, "Good night, Mr. Harrington. Call if you need anything." I walked home through Queens that night in a daze, the sounds of the city washing over me without really registering, sirens in the distance, the rumble of the subway, teenagers speaking Spanish on street corners, all the sounds of my real life, the life that existed outside their marble tower. I thought about Carmen, now 17 and preparing for college applications. I thought about all the moments of her life I had missed while caring for people who didn't truly see me as human. For the first time in decades, I was angry. Not the quiet, swallowed anger I was used to, but a burning rage that demanded action. The next morning, I made a decision that terrified and exhilarated me. I was going to change the entire game. I started small. I began taking my full lunch breaks, leaving the building entirely instead of eating quickly in their kitchen. I stopped working late without compensation. I refused overtime requests that weren't true emergencies. When Mrs. Harrington complained that I seemed less committed lately, I simply said, "I'm working exactly the hours I'm being paid for." The shift in the household was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Breed Arfa Harrington's mask of polished control began to slip. She snapped at me over minor issues: dust on a surface I'd cleaned the day before, flowers arranged differently than usual. "We've always been able to depend on you, Rosa," she said during one of these confrontations. "I hope you're not getting ideas above your station." Above my station. The phrase revealed everything about how she really saw me. Despite her occasional claims that I was like family, I was meant to stay in my designated place, grateful and invisible, no matter how much my role expanded or how essential my work became. Mr. Harrington's behavior also began to change. He watched me more carefully during our interactions, and I could feel him trying to read my mood, my level of commitment. Sometimes I caught him moving slightly when he thought I wasn't looking, shifting position in his wheelchair, flexing his hands in ways that contradicted his supposed paralysis. The deception was wearing on him, making him careless. But the real drama came from Mrs. Harrington herself. Faced with the possibility that I might actually leave, she began showing her true colors. She tried bribing me with small bonuses and gifts that felt more like insults than appreciation. She complained to her friends about the unreliability of domestic help these days, loud enough for me to overhear. She even went so far as to suggest that I was becoming emotionally unstable under the stress of Mr. Harrington's condition. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in early summer. I had requested the afternoon off to attend a parent-teacher conference call with Carmen's school counselor. Her first real conversation about college applications, something I desperately wanted to be part of even from a distance. Mrs. Harrington denied the request, claiming that Mr. Harrington had a crucial doctor's appointment that required my assistance. I later discovered that the appointment was at their dermatologist, a routine check for a man supposedly paralyzed from the waist down. That night, I made a phone call that would change everything. I called Carmen for the first time in months, not just to exchange our usual few minutes of small talk, but to have a real conversation about our lives, our relationship, our future. "Mommy," she said, and her voice was deeper than I remembered, more mature. "I miss you. I know you work hard for us, but I miss having my mother here." I cried then, sitting in my tiny Queens apartment, looking out at the city lights that never seemed to include me in their promise of excitement and opportunity. My daughter was going to graduate high school, probably go to college, maybe get married and have children of her own, and I was missing all of it to take care of people who saw me as replaceable. "What if I came home?" I asked her. The words surprised me as much as they must have surprised her. "Really? You mean it?" For the first time in years, I meant it completely. The next morning, I walked into that penthouse with a different energy. I carried myself differently, moved through their spaces with a new kind of purpose. Mrs. Harrington noticed immediately. "You seem different today, Rosa. I hope yesterday's conversation didn't upset you too much. You know we value you tremendously." Value. Such a careful word. So different from words like love, or appreciate, or respect. That's when Mr. Harrington made his mistake. He called me into his study, ostensibly to discuss adjustments to his medication schedule. But as I approached his wheelchair, I deliberately knocked a pen off his desk. Without thinking, he bent forward to catch it, a movement that would have been impossible for someone truly paralyzed from the waist down. Our eyes met in that moment, and he knew that I knew. "Rosa," he said quietly, "I can explain." "Can you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "Can you explain 3 months of lies? Can you explain letting me work myself to exhaustion caring for an injury that doesn't exist? Can you explain using me to test your wife's loyalty while never once considering mine?" He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "It's not what you think. I had to know. I had to see who she really was when things got difficult. "And what did you learn?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I learned that she's not who I thought she was. But I also learned something else. I learned what real care looks like. What you've given me these past months, that's not something you can fake or test for. That's just who you are." His words should have felt like vindication, but they only made me angrier. "You learned what real care looks like because I gave it to you freely, believing you needed it. What happens when someone tests your loyalty and finds it wanting, Mr. Harrington? What happens when the person you've trusted with your most vulnerable moments turns out to be lying to you?" I left him sitting there and walked straight to Mrs. Harrington's dressing room, where she was preparing for another lunch with her socialite friends. "Mrs. Harrington," I said, "I need to speak with you." She looked up from her makeup mirror, annoyed at the interruption. "Can it wait, Rosa? I'm already running late." "Your husband isn't paralyzed." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Her face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, calculation, before settling into something cold and sharp. "Excuse me?" "He's been pretending for months, testing you, watching to see how you'd react to being married to a disabled man." For a moment, I thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of her vanity table, her knuckles white against her manicured nails. Then something changed in her expression, and I saw her real face for the first time, the face behind all the politeness and social graces. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you come into my home and spread such vicious lies? I'm not lying, and you know it. You've suspected something was off this whole time. You've been waiting for an excuse to stop pretending you care about him." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house immediately." "Good," I said, turning toward the door, "because I quit." The confrontation I had been avoiding for 9 years was finally happening, and I discovered I wasn't afraid anymore. I was tired of being afraid, but Mrs. Harrington wasn't finished. "Don't think you can just walk away from this, Rosa. I know people, important people. I can make sure you never work in this city again." I paused in the doorway and looked back at her. She was perfectly put together as always. Designer dress, flawless makeup, expensive jewelry. But there was something desperate in her eyes that made her seem smaller somehow. "Go ahead," I said. "Tell your important friends that I'm not suitable for employment because I won't participate in your husband's lies or pretend not to notice your neglect. See how that conversation goes." I walked out of that room and straight to Mr. Harrington's study, where he was still sitting in his wheelchair, looking defeated. "I told her," I said simply. He nodded slowly. "I figured you would. Why did you do it?" "Really?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was scared she didn't love me anymore. Because I wanted to believe that underneath all the shopping and socializing and complaining, there was still the woman I married 25 years ago. I thought if I could just see her in a crisis, see her take care of me the way you have. But she's not me," I said, "and you can't test someone into being someone else." "No," he agreed, "you can't." I started to leave, then turned back one more time. "For what it's worth, Mr. Harrington, the care I gave you was real. Even if your condition wasn't, my compassion was genuine. That's the difference between us. I don't know how to be fake." That afternoon, I packed my few belongings from the small room I'd occupied in their apartment. 9 years of my life fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. As I folded my uniforms for the last time, I realized I had no idea what I was going to wear tomorrow. For nearly a decade, my entire wardrobe had consisted of work clothes. I had no idea who Rosa Martinez was when she wasn't serving the Harrington family. Mrs. Chen found me in the service elevator as I was carrying my things downstairs. "Leaving?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Finally," I said. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen in that building in months. "Good for you, Rosa. Where will you go?" "Home," I said, and realized I meant it for the first time in years. But before I could leave New York completely, there was something I needed to do. I used some of my savings to hire a lawyer, not for revenge, but for clarity. I wanted to understand my rights, what I might be owed after 9 years of faithful service. The lawyer, a kind woman named Janet Torres who specialized in domestic worker rights, reviewed my employment records and asked careful questions about my working conditions. What she told me changed everything. "Rosa, you've been systematically underpaid for years. The overtime hours alone add up to thousands of dollars. And if they were requiring you to live on the premises, there are additional protections and compensations that should have applied." More importantly, she discovered something I had no idea existed. Mr. Harrington's father, who had built the family fortune through savvy stock market investments and early cryptocurrency adoption, had established a trust with provisions for long-term household staff. Any employee who served the family faithfully for more than 5 years was entitled to a pension and health care benefits. The Harringtons had never mentioned this trust, had never offered me the benefits I was legally entitled to. The amount was significant, not life-changing wealth, but enough to give me real choices for the first time in my adult life. Enough to go home to Puerto Rico and help Carmen with college without worrying about how we'd pay rent. When Janet contacted the Harringtons' lawyers with this information, the response was swift and desperate. They offered to settle immediately, no questions asked, in exchange for my silence about Mr. Harrington's deception. They were terrified that the story would become public, that their carefully constructed image would crumble. I accepted their settlement, but not their silence. I couldn't expose Mr. Harrington's lies without destroying people who didn't deserve it. Their children, their employees who depended on their jobs. But I could tell my own story, share my own truth about what it was like to serve invisibly for so many years. The money from the settlement wasn't just compensation for past work. It was freedom, real, tangible freedom to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. I used part of it to fly home to Puerto Rico for the first time in 9 years. When I saw Carmen waiting for me at the San Juan airport, I almost didn't recognize her. She was taller than me now, confident and beautiful, with my eyes but a strength I'd never possessed at her age. "Mommy," she said, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming back to life. "You're really here." "I'm really here," I said, and meant it in ways that went far beyond geography. We spent 3 weeks together, talking about everything, her dreams of studying engineering, my years in New York, the relationship we wanted to build now that I was free to prioritize her. She told me about feeling abandoned sometimes, but also about understanding that I had sacrificed for her future. We cried together and laughed together and planned together in ways we'd never been able to do over brief phone calls. But I had one more thing to do before I could truly move forward. I flew back to New York one last time, not to return to my old life, but to close that chapter properly. I wanted to see Mrs. Chen, to thank her for being the one person in that building who had seen me as human. I wanted to walk through Central Park in daylight, as a visitor rather than someone grabbing a few minutes between shifts. I wanted to prove to myself that I could exist in that city without being invisible. On my last day, I walked past the Harrington building. Through the lobby windows, I could see the marble floors I used to polish, the crystal chandeliers I used to clean, but I felt no longing, no regret. That life belonged to someone else, a woman who had forgotten her own worth, who had mistaken being needed for being valued. Mrs. Chen was working her usual shift when I stopped by to say goodbye. "You look different," she said, studying my face. "Lighter." "I feel different. How are things upstairs?" She shrugged. "Same as always. New housekeeper started last week. Young girl from Guatemala. Mrs. Harrington is already complaining that she doesn't do things the way you used to." I felt a moment of sympathy for my replacement, whoever she was. But I also felt something else, confidence that she would find her own way, make her own choices. Maybe she would stay for 9 years, or maybe she would leave after 9 months. Either way, it would be her decision. "Give her this," I said, handing Mrs. Chen a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter I'd written to the new housekeeper, sharing some practical advice about the job, but more importantly, about knowing her worth, setting boundaries, and remembering that she was a whole person beyond her service to others. 6 months later, I was settled into a small house in San Juan with a garden where I grew herbs and vegetables, a front porch where I could watch the sunset, and Carmen visiting every weekend while she finished her senior year of high school. I had started working part-time for a local nonprofit that helped domestic workers understand their rights, not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to prevent other women from disappearing the way I had. The work was fulfilling in ways I'd never experienced. Instead of polishing other people's achievements, I was helping women recognize their own value. Instead of being invisible, I was helping others become seen. Instead of serving in silence, I was finding my voice. One evening, while Carmen and I were making dinner together, she asked me something that caught me off guard. "Mommy, do you ever regret those years in New York? All that time we lost?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "I regret the time we lost, mija. I regret not being here for your quinceañera, your school plays, your first heartbreak. But I don't regret the work itself. Even in that house, even being invisible, I was learning something important about care, about dignity, about what it means to give of yourself." "What did you learn?" "I learned that real care can't be faked or tested or demanded. It has to be given freely and it has to be mutual. I gave everything to that family, but they never gave anything back to me. Not recognition, not respect, not even basic kindness most of the time. That's not care. That's exploitation." Carmen nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" Now I looked around our small house, at the photographs of us together on the walls, at the books Carmen was studying for her college entrance exams, at the simple meal we were preparing with ingredients from our own garden. Now I understand the difference between being needed and being valued, between serving others and serving yourself into disappearance. The transformation wasn't just external. New location, new work, new relationship with my daughter. It was internal, too. I walked differently now, with my shoulders back and my head up. I spoke differently, without the apologetic tone that had crept into every interaction during my years of invisible service. I made eye contact when meeting new people, introduced myself with my full name rather than just Rosa the housekeeper. Most importantly, I had learned to say no, not with anger or defensiveness, but with calm certainty about my own boundaries. When the nonprofit asked me to work weekends for 3 months straight, I explained that I had prior commitments to my family. When neighbors asked me to babysit their children for free because "you're so good with kids," I politely declined or quoted them a fair rate for my time. The hardest part of this new life was learning to accept kindness without suspicion. After years of conditional care, help offered only when it served someone else's needs, I struggled to trust gestures that seemed genuinely generous. When Carmen surprised me with flowers for my birthday, I automatically wondered what she needed from me. When my neighbor brought me soup during a mild cold, I worried about what I owed in return. But slowly, I was learning to accept love without earning it, care without deserving it, appreciation without performing for it. A year after leaving New York, I received an unexpected letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Marcus, one of the Harrington twins I had helped raise. He was writing to tell me that he had always remembered my kindness during his childhood, that he understood now how much I had sacrificed to care for their family. He wanted to thank me and to let me know that he was using some of his cryptocurrency wealth to establish a fund for domestic workers' education and support. The letter was kind and genuine, and it helped heal something I hadn't even realized was still wounded. It reminded me that not all of my care during those years had been wasted, that some seeds of compassion I had planted had taken root in unexpected places, But the real healing came from my daily life in Puerto Rico, from morning coffee with Carmen before she left for school, from conversations with my sister Maria about everything we'd both learned while raising a child between us, from the simple pleasure of cooking meals for people who thanked me for them, from working in advocacy where my voice mattered, where my experience was valued, where helping others didn't require making myself invisible. I also found unexpected romance. Antonio, a widower who worked at the nonprofit's partner organization, began bringing me coffee during our joint meetings. He was gentle and patient, with laugh lines around his eyes and hands that had worked construction for 30 years. Our courtship was slow and careful. Two people who had learned to protect themselves, discovering that they could be safe with each other. "You deserve care too, Rosa," he told me one evening as we walked along the beach. "You know that, right? You don't have to earn it or work for it or prove you're worthy of it." The words brought tears to my eyes because they were true and because it had taken me 60 years to hear them. Carmen graduated high school with honors and decided to attend the University of Puerto Rico to study engineering. She could have gone to schools on the mainland, could have followed the path I had once taken away from the island. But she chose to stay, she said, because she wanted to build something here, wanted to be part of the solution rather than the exodus. "Besides," she told me with a smile that reminded me of my own mother, "I have too much lost time to make up with you." On her graduation day, I sat in the audience wearing a dress I had chosen for myself, not a uniform, not something practical for someone else's needs, but something beautiful that made me feel happy. I watched my daughter walk across that stage, and I thought about all the stages I had missed, all the moments I had sacrificed. But I also thought about the woman I had become because of those sacrifices, not in spite of them, but because of them. I had learned resilience and compassion and the difference between serving others and serving yourself into nothingness. I had learned that dignity comes from within, not from others' recognition. I had learned that love freely given is never wasted, even when it's not returned. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to change your life, to demand more for yourself, to step out of the shadows and into your own light. 2 years after leaving New York, I received one final communication from that chapter of my life. Mrs. Conrail Harrington sent a brief note through her lawyer, asking if I would be willing to provide a reference for their new housekeeper, who was apparently struggling with the demanding nature of the position. I wrote back through my own lawyer. Yes, I had kept Janet Torres on retainer, not because I expected more legal trouble, but because having an advocate had become part of my commitment to valuing myself. My message was simple. I would be happy to speak with their employee about workers' rights, fair compensation, and professional boundaries. I was not willing to help them find someone else to disappear into their marble tower of wealth and indifference. They never followed up. These days, I wake up each morning in my small house with the sun streaming through windows I chose, in a bed I bought for my own comfort, wearing clothes that make me feel like myself. I make coffee strong and sweet the way I like it, not the way someone else prefers it. I tend my garden because growing things brings me joy, not because someone else's aesthetic requires perfect landscaping. Carmen is in her second year of college now, studying mechanical engineering and working part-time at a nonprofit that brings sustainable technology to rural communities. She stops by twice a week for dinner, and we talk about her classes, her friends, her dreams for the future. Sometimes we talk about those years when I was gone, but without the pain that once made those conversations too difficult to have. "I used to be angry," she told me recently. Angry that other kids had their mothers at every soccer game, every school play, every birthday party. But now I think maybe I learned something valuable from watching you sacrifice for our future. "What did you learn?" "I learned what not to do," she said with a laugh that took any sting out of the words. "I learned that taking care of others is beautiful, but disappearing yourself in service to others is not. I learned that I want to help people, but I also want to help myself." The work I do now with domestic workers has expanded beyond my original part-time role. I help women understand their legal rights, negotiate fair wages, and recognize the signs of exploitation. I also help them with something harder, understanding their worth beyond their usefulness to others. You are not a service, I tell each woman I work with. You provide a service. You are a human being with needs and feelings and dreams, and the right to be treated with dignity. It's a lesson I'm still learning myself every day. Antonio and I married last spring in a small ceremony in my garden, surrounded by Carmen, Maria, and a few close friends from our work community. It wasn't the kind of elaborate wedding the Harringtons had renewed their vows with during my 5th year working for them. No crystal chandeliers or designer flowers or photographers capturing every moment, but it was real and joyful and entirely ours. During our vows, Antonio promised to see me, value me, and support my dreams even when they required sacrifice from him, too. I promised the same in return. We were two people who had learned the difference between being needed and being loved, creating something together based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Our honeymoon was a week in Carmen's old room, sleeping late and making breakfast together, and talking about everything and nothing, simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after a lifetime of serving others' complex needs. I still think about my years in New York sometimes, but not with bitterness anymore. I think about them the way you might think about a difficult book that taught you something important, grateful for the lessons, but glad to have finished the story. Sometimes I wonder about Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, whether they ever figured out how to actually care for each other instead of testing each other's loyalty. I wonder about their sons, whether they learned to see their employees as human beings. I wonder about my replacement, whether she's found ways to maintain her dignity while doing work that can so easily erase your sense of self. Mostly, though, I think about the future. Carmen will graduate next year and start her career as an engineer. Antonio and I are talking about traveling together, visiting places I've always wanted to see as tourists rather than workers. I'm considering writing a book about domestic workers' experiences, adding my voice to the growing movement for recognition and rights. But my favorite moments are still the quiet ones. Evening coffee on my front porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sunday dinners with 3 generations of women from my family, sharing stories and laughter around a table where everyone's voice matters equally. Ordinary Tuesday mornings when I wake up and remember that today, like every day now, belongs to me. I'm 60 years old and I finally know who Rosa Martinez is when she's not serving someone else's story. She's a mother, a wife, an advocate, a friend. She grows beautiful vegetables and makes terrible jokes and cries during romantic movies. She's generous with her time but protective of her energy. She loves deeply but no longer loves desperately. She serves others from choice rather than obligation. She's free. The work at the nonprofit has taught me things about myself I never expected to discover. Every woman who walks through our doors carries her own version of my story. Different details, same wounds. There's Elena, who cleaned offices downtown for 15 years before realizing her employers were stealing from her paychecks. There's Sophia, who raised 3 children for a wealthy family, while her own son grew up with his grandmother in El Salvador. There's Maria del Carmen, who worked as a live-in caregiver for an elderly woman who treated her like an indentured servant, never allowing days off, never acknowledging the sacrifices she made. We sit in a circle every Thursday evening in the small community center downtown, 8 to 12 women, depending on the week, sharing stories over coffee and pastries that Maria bakes at her new job in a bakery that treats her like the skilled professional she is. These sessions weren't my idea originally. They grew organically from one-on-one meetings that became group conversations, that became something like group therapy, though we've never called it that. Tell me, I ask each new woman who joins us, when was the last time you did something just because it made you happy? The answers are always heartbreaking. I can't remember, they say, or what do you mean? as if the concept of personal joy is foreign territory they've never been allowed to explore. Last month, we helped a woman named Esperanza file a wage theft complaint against the restaurant family she'd worked for in their home. She'd been cooking elaborate dinner parties for their friends, working 16-hour days during their frequent entertaining seasons, never receiving overtime pay or even basic recognition for the culinary skills that made their social events legendary among their wealthy social circle. The family had become so comfortable with her invisibility that they would discuss private family matters in front of her as if she weren't there, forgetting that she understood English perfectly well. They talked about their son's drug problems, their daughter's eating disorder, their own marriage counseling, she told our group, her voice growing stronger with each session. They trusted me with their most intimate secrets but never trusted me enough to pay me what I was worth. The legal victory was swift and decisive. Wage theft cases with clear documentation rarely make it to court, but the personal victory was more complex and harder won. Esperanza had to learn to value her own skills, to see herself as a professional rather than someone grateful for whatever scraps of employment she could find. "I'm a chef," she told us one evening, the words sounding strange and wonderful in her mouth. "I'm not just someone who cooks. I'm a chef." These stories reminded me of my own journey, but they also showed me how many different ways invisibility can manifest. Some of the women had been physically isolated, working alone in wealthy homes with minimal outside contact. Others had been emotionally isolated, surrounded by employers who treated them kindly on the surface, while systematically undermining their sense of self-worth. Still others had been professionally isolated, performing skilled work, childcare, elder care, household management, that was dismissed as unskilled labor by people who couldn't manage their own basic domestic needs. What united us all was the slow, difficult work of remembering who we were before we learned to disappear. The breakthrough for me came during a session about boundaries. We were discussing how to say no to unreasonable demands, how to negotiate for fair treatment, how to maintain your sense of self while doing work that requires constant adaptation to other people's needs and preferences. "But what if they replace me?" asked Luce, a woman who'd been caring for an elderly man with dementia for 3 years. "What if I ask for 1 day off per week and they just find someone else who won't ask for anything?" It was the question we all carried, the fear that kept us accepting unacceptable situations, the fear that our needs, our boundaries, our basic humanity were luxuries we couldn't afford. "Then they replace you with someone who will have to learn what you learned," I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke. "They replace you with someone who doesn't yet know his routines, his preferences, his triggers. They replace you with someone who will make the mistakes you've already learned from. They replace you with someone who cares less about his well-being than you do." I paused, looking around the circle at these women who had given so much of themselves that they'd forgotten their own power. "And they replace you with someone who doesn't know her own worth yet. Someone who will eventually learn what we've learned, who will eventually ask for what we're asking for. The cycle continues until employers realize that treating us fairly is easier than constantly training new people." Luce considered this for a moment. "So my leaving isn't just about me. Your leaving is about all of us. Your staying in a bad situation is about all of us too. When we accept less than we deserve, we make it easier for employers to expect the same from everyone else." The session ended with Luce scheduling a conversation with her employer about revised terms of employment. She asked for 2 days off per week, a clear schedule of duties, and compensation for the additional emotional labor involved in dementia care. To her surprise, they agreed immediately. "I think they were afraid I was going to quit entirely," she told us the next week. "I had been thinking I was so easily replaceable, but they had been worried about losing me for months." These conversations began to change how I thought about my own story. For years, I had framed my experience with the Harringtons as a cautionary tale about exploitation and invisibility. But now I was beginning to see it as something else. A story about the power we possess even when we feel powerless. The choices we can make even in constrained circumstances. The moment when we decide to stop disappearing and start demanding to be seen. The growth of our support group led to opportunities I never could have imagined during my years of silent service. Local journalists started reaching out, wanting to write about domestic workers' rights and the hidden workforce that made wealthy neighborhoods function. At first, I was reluctant to speak publicly. A lifetime of invisibility doesn't prepare you for the spotlight, even when the spotlight serves a good purpose. But Carmen encouraged me to share our story. "Mommy, you always told me that silence protects the wrong people. Now you have a chance to protect the right people by refusing to be silent." My first interview was with a Spanish-language radio station that reached domestic workers throughout the metropolitan area. I told them about the 9 years I'd spent polishing other people's lives while my own grew dim, about discovering Mr. Harrington's deception, about finding the courage to reclaim my dignity and my future. But I also talked about the sisterhood I'd found among women doing similar work, the wisdom and resilience of workers who had been dismissed as unskilled, the importance of recognizing domestic work as real work deserving of real protection. The response was overwhelming. The radio station received dozens of calls from listeners who wanted to know more about workers' rights, about our support group, about resources for people in similar situations. We started getting referrals from churches, from community centers, from word-of-mouth networks that connected women across ethnic and linguistic barriers. Within 6 months, our Thursday evening circle had become a weekly resource center, a Saturday morning Know Your Rights workshop, and a referral network for lawyers, social services, and alternative employment opportunities. We weren't just helping women escape bad situations anymore. We were helping them envision and create better ones. The work was deeply fulfilling, but it was also exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every story I heard carried echoes of my own trauma, my own years of disappearing. Some nights I came home from our workshops feeling drained and angry, not at the women who shared their experiences, but at the systems that made such experiences so common. Carmen noticed the toll the work was taking on me. "You're starting to look the way you used to look in New York," she said one evening when I came home particularly depleted, "like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders." She was right. I was falling into old patterns, trying to save everyone while neglecting my own needs. The skills that had made me a good caregiver, empathy, selflessness, the ability to anticipate others' needs, were becoming obstacles in my advocacy work. I was burning out on behalf of people I was trying to help, forgetting the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish in my personal life. Antonio suggested I take a sabbatical from the nonprofit work, just a few weeks to rest and gain perspective. The idea terrified me. What if the women stopped coming to our sessions? What if the momentum we'd built dissipated? What if taking care of myself meant failing to take care of others? But then I remembered something I'd learned in my own recovery from invisibility. Modeling self-respect teaches others to demand respect for themselves. If I burned out trying to help other women find balance, what kind of message did that send about the possibility of sustainable change? I took 2 weeks off from the advocacy work and spent them doing things that fed my soul rather than depleting it. I read novels in my garden, books I chose for pleasure rather than education. I cooked elaborate meals for Antonio and Carmen, not because it was expected, but because I enjoyed the creativity and the conversation that happened around our dinner table. I took long walks through Old San Juan, visiting the places I dreamed about during my years in Manhattan penthouses, seeing them now through eyes that belonged to a tourist in my own homeland. Most importantly, I spent time alone. After decades of constant service to others, solitude still felt like a luxury I needed permission to enjoy. But gradually, I remembered how to occupy space without apologizing for it, how to enjoy my own company without feeling guilty for not being useful to others. When I returned to the nonprofit work, I did it differently. I established clear boundaries about my availability, both for individual consultations and for group support. I trained other women to facilitate some of our sessions, distributing the emotional labor rather than absorbing it all myself. I made space for my own story to be one story among many, rather than the template against which all other experiences were measured. The changes improved both the quality of our work and the sustainability of our organization. Women who had been receiving help began providing help to newer members. Our group developed expertise in different areas. Some members became skilled at wage theft documentation, others at immigration issues, still others at negotiating with employers who were willing to change but needed guidance about fair practices. We also began reaching beyond our immediate community. Other cities had domestic workers organizing for better conditions, and we started participating in regional and national networks. I found myself traveling to conferences and strategy meetings, sharing what we'd learned in Puerto Rico and learning from organizers who were fighting similar battles in different contexts. At one conference in Chicago, I met a woman named Grace who had worked for 23 years as a nanny for a family in Evanston. Her experiences were eerily similar to mine. The gradual expansion of responsibilities without corresponding increases in compensation, the emotional labor of caring for children while missing milestones in her own daughter's life, the persistent sense that her own needs were less important than those of the family she served. But Grace's story had a different ending. Instead of reaching a breaking point and leaving, she had organized with other nannies and housekeepers in her area to demand better working conditions collectively. They had formed a workers' association, negotiated a standard pay scale, and created a support network that prevented individual employers from exploiting workers' isolation. The difference was, Grace told me over coffee during a conference break, I learned early that my situation wasn't unique to me. When you think you're the only one experiencing something, you blame yourself for not being strong enough or smart enough to fix it. When you realize the problem is structural, you can organize to change the structure. Her words stayed with me long after the conference ended. My experience with the Harringtons had felt intensely personal, a story about one family's dysfunction and one woman's journey towards self-respect. But listening to dozens of similar stories from women across different regions, different economic levels, different family structures, I began to see patterns that went far beyond individual relationships. The problems we faced weren't character flaws or bad luck. They were predictable outcomes of systems that devalued reproductive labor, that treated care work as naturally women's work, regardless of compensation or working conditions, that assumed women's needs were secondary to family needs even when we weren't part of those families. Understanding this systemic dimension of our experiences changed how I thought about solutions. Individual empowerment was essential. Women needed to learn their worth, set boundaries, demand fair treatment. But individual empowerment without systemic change just meant that aware, confident women would leave bad situations and be replaced by women who hadn't yet learned their power. This realization led to the most ambitious project our organization had undertaken. Working with partners in 3 other cities, we drafted model legislation for domestic workers' rights, a bill that would establish basic labor protections, ensure access to benefits, and create mechanisms for addressing workplace violations. The process took 2 years of research, drafting, lobbying, and coalition building. I found myself in rooms I never could have imagined entering during my years of invisible service. Legislative offices, legal conferences, meetings with labor union representatives, and immigrant rights advocates. Sometimes I felt out of place, acutely aware of my accent, my education level, my background as just a housekeeper. But then I would remember that my experience qualified me to speak about domestic work in ways that law degrees and policy expertise couldn't match. The first time I testified before a legislative subcommittee, my hands shook so badly I could barely read my prepared statement. I had written about my years with the Harringtons, about the wage theft and exploitation I'd experienced, about the women I now worked with who faced similar challenges. But standing at that podium, facing a room full of mostly male lawmakers who had never cleaned someone else's house or raised someone else's children, I felt the old, familiar invisibility threatening to swallow me. Then I looked out at the gallery and saw Carmen, who had taken a day off from her engineering classes to be there. I saw Antonio, who had driven 3 hours to San Juan to support me. I saw Maria, Elena, Luz, and half a dozen other women from our support group, all dressed in their best clothes, all there to witness their experiences being spoken aloud in a room where policy was made. "My name is Rosa Martinez," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "For 9 years, I was invisible in a Manhattan penthouse, caring for a family who never saw me as fully human. I'm here today to make sure that other women like me never have to choose between dignified work and survival." The bill didn't pass that year, but it started conversations that continued in committee hearings, community forums, and editorial pages. More importantly, it gave women like us a framework for talking about our experiences as labor rights issues rather than personal struggles. It helped us see ourselves as workers deserving of legal protection, rather than individuals hoping for better treatment from benevolent employers. The organizing work also connected me with a broader movement of women who had transformed their own experiences of exploitation into advocacy for systemic change. I met former garment workers who had become labor organizers, former agricultural workers who had become policy advocates, former restaurant workers who had become small business owners committed to fair employment practices. These women taught me that healing from invisibility wasn't just about recovering your individual sense of self. It was about working to change the conditions that made disappearing feel necessary in the first place. Personal recovery and political action weren't separate processes, but part of the same journey toward dignity and visibility. As our 3rd anniversary as an organization approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed, not just in my own life, but in the lives of the women I worked with and the broader conversation about domestic workers' rights. We had helped dozens of women recover stolen wages, negotiate better working conditions, and find employment with employers who respected their humanity. We had changed local policies, influenced regional organizing strategies, and contributed to national conversations about the value of care work. But perhaps most importantly, we had created a space where women who had been isolated and invisible could come together, share their experiences, and remember that they deserved better than the conditions they had accepted. We had broken the silence that kept exploitation invisible and made it possible for women to see their individual struggles as part of a larger pattern that could be changed through collective action. The anniversary celebration was held in the community center, where our support group met every Thursday. Women brought food from their home countries, Esperanza's mole from Mexico, Elena's pupusas from El Salvador, Luz's rice and beans from the Dominican Republic, my own pastels from Puerto Rico. The diversity of languages and accents in the room reminded me that domestic work crosses all ethnic and national boundaries, that the experience of invisibility was something migrant women shared, regardless of where we had come from or where we were going. Carmen gave a short speech about watching her mother transform from someone who apologized for taking up space to someone who demanded space for others. Antonio talked about the ripple effect of individual healing, how Rosa claiming her own dignity had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Several of the women shared their own stories of change, of small and large victories in their working lives, of relationships with employers that had shifted from exploitation toward mutual respect. But the comments that moved me most came from newer members of our group, women who were just beginning to recognize their own worth. "When I first came here," said Patricia, who had been working for the same family for 12 years without a raise, "I thought my problems were because I wasn't grateful enough, wasn't flexible enough, wasn't good enough at my job. Now I understand that the problem wasn't me. The problem was that I was being exploited, and that's not the same thing. Her words reminded me of my own journey from self-blame to analysis, from individual shame to collective action. The transformation wasn't just about changing our circumstances, though that was important. It was about changing how we understood our circumstances, how we interpreted our experiences, how we imagined our possibilities. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I found myself standing in the empty community center with Carmen and Antonio, looking at the photos we'd displayed showing the growth of our organization, pictures of our first nervous support group meetings, our first public speaking events, our first legislative testimony. Pictures of women who had started as clients and become advocates, who had begun by asking for help and ended by providing leadership. "Mommy," Carmen said, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had stayed in New York? If you had never confronted Mr. Harrington, never quit, never came home?" I considered the question seriously. I think about it sometimes. I think I would have disappeared completely, eventually, just faded away until there was nothing left of Rosa Martinez except the work she did for other people. But you didn't. No, I didn't. And neither did any of the other women who found their way to our group. We all decided at some point that we were worth more than our usefulness to others. What made the difference? What made you choose differently? It was a question I'd been asked by journalists, by researchers studying domestic workers, by women trying to understand their own situations. The answer was complex and personal to each woman's circumstances, but there were common threads. "I think it was realizing that I had a choice," I said slowly. "For so long, I thought my options were to stay invisible and be grateful for the work, or to speak up and lose everything. I didn't realize there was a third option, to leave the situation that required me to be invisible and create conditions where I could be seen. And that third option was only possible because you had support," Antonio added. "The legal help, the settlement money, the family waiting for you in Puerto Rico. Not every woman has those resources." He was right, and it was something I thought about often in my advocacy work. My escape from exploitation had been made possible by a combination of factors: financial resources, family support, legal knowledge, and the particular circumstances of Mr. Harrington's deception that gave me leverage in negotiations. Not every woman in similar situations had access to the same resources, but what we could provide was community, information, and mutual support. We could help women understand their legal rights, connect with resources, and develop strategies for incremental change, even when immediate escape wasn't possible. We could help them maintain their sense of self-worth while navigating impossible choices. We could help them see that their individual struggles were part of a larger pattern that could be addressed through collective action. Most importantly, we could help them remember that they were whole people with needs and dreams and rights, not just service providers grateful for whatever treatment they received. The work continued to evolve as our understanding deepened and our network expanded. We started offering English classes for women who wanted to improve their economic opportunities. We partnered with vocational schools to provide training in skills that could lead to better paying work. We created a microloan program that helped women start their own household services businesses, setting their own prices and working conditions. We also began working with employers who wanted to do better but didn't know how. Many of the families who hired domestic workers genuinely cared about treating their employees fairly, but they had grown up in systems that normalized exploitation and had never learned to see household employees as professionals deserving of standard employment practices. These employers needed education about fair wages, clear job descriptions, appropriate boundaries between personal and professional relationships. They needed to understand that hiring someone to work in your home didn't give you unlimited access to their labor, their emotions, or their personal lives. They needed to learn the difference between kindness and respect, between gratitude and compensation, between treating someone well and treating someone fairly. The employer education workshops were some of the most challenging work we did because they required us to build bridge-building relationships with people who held structural power over domestic workers while still advocating clearly for workers' rights. But they were also some of the most important work because they addressed the demand side of the exploitation equation. One participant in these workshops was Jennifer, a pediatric surgeon who employed a full-time nanny for her 2 young children. She came to our workshop after her previous nanny quit abruptly, telling her that she had been unfair and demanding without providing specifics about what needed to change. I thought I was being reasonable, Jennifer told our group during her first session. I paid above minimum wage, I gave her bonuses at Christmas, I told her all the time how much we appreciated her. I don't understand what I was doing wrong. As we worked through the specifics of her employment practices, the issues became clear. Jennifer had been paying above minimum wage, but not accounting for overtime, despite expecting her nanny to be available for evenings and weekends when medical emergencies arose. She gave Christmas bonuses, but had never provided paid vacation or sick leave. She had expressed appreciation, but had also expected her nanny to do household tasks unrelated to childcare without additional compensation. Most problematically, she had treated her nanny's personal life as secondary to the family's needs. When the nanny asked for time off to attend her own daughter's school play, Jennifer had made her feel guilty about leaving during a busy period at the hospital. When the nanny was sick, Jennifer had asked her to come in anyway because she couldn't find alternative childcare. I think I confused being friendly with being fair, Jennifer realized by the end of the workshop series. I thought that because I talked to her about personal things and invited her to family events, that made up for not giving her basic employment protections. Jennifer became one of our most effective advocates among professional families, sharing what she'd learned with other working parents and helping them understand that good intentions weren't enough. Structural fairness required intentional policies and practices. These employer education efforts helped me understand that exploitation in domestic work wasn't usually the result of malicious intent. More often, it was the result of systems that had normalized the invisibility of reproductive labor and made it seem natural for families to have unlimited access to care workers' time and energy. Changing those systems required work on multiple levels: policy changes that established legal protections, cultural changes that recognized care work as skilled and valuable labor, and individual changes in how families understood their relationships with the people they employed to maintain their households and care for their family members. 5 years after leaving New York, I received an invitation that surprised me. Marcus Harrington, the older of the 2 boys I had helped raise, was getting married and wanted me to attend his wedding. The invitation came with a long letter explaining how my influence had shaped his understanding of fairness and respect, how watching me care for his family had taught him lessons about dignity that he was now applying in his own life and business practices. He had used his cryptocurrency wealth not only to establish the fund for domestic workers, but also to create a family foundation focused on labor rights and economic justice. He wanted me to consider joining the foundation's advisory board, bringing my experience and advocacy skills to their grant-making and policy work. The invitation forced me to confront feelings I thought I had resolved. Part of me was touched by Marcus's recognition and his commitment to making amends for his family's treatment of domestic workers. Part of me was angry that he had the resources to be philanthropic, primarily because his family had built that wealth through exploiting workers like me. Part of me was proud that the care I had given him had planted seeds that were growing into meaningful work for social justice. I discussed the opportunity with Carmen and Antonio, with my sister Maria, and with my closest colleagues in the advocacy world. The consensus was that I could probably do more good working with the foundation than against it, that having domestic workers' voices represented in philanthropic decisions could help direct resources to the most effective organizing efforts. But first, I needed to set clear boundaries about the relationship. I would serve on the advisory board as a professional advocate, not as someone grateful for the family's belated recognition. I would advocate for funding priorities that supported worker organizing and systemic change, not just charitable services that left power structures unchanged. I would use my position to amplify other domestic workers' voices, not just my own story of individual transformation. Most importantly, I would not attend Marcus's wedding. The invitation was kind, but accepting it would blur the boundaries between my personal history with the family and my professional role as an advocate. My relationship with the Harringtons belonged to the past, to a version of myself that no longer existed. My work with their foundation was about the future, about creating better conditions for women who were currently living the life I had once lived. Marcus understood and respected my boundaries. Our first foundation board meeting was held in a conference room in a neutral nonprofit space, not in the family's penthouse. The other board members included labor economists, policy advocates, and community organizers alongside wealthy donors. The conversation focused on funding strategies and impact measurement, not on personal relationships or individual stories of redemption. Working with the foundation allowed me to operate at a different scale than our grassroots organizing in Puerto Rico. We funded domestic workers' organizations in 12 cities, supported legislative advocacy in 5 states, and sponsored research that documented the scope of wage theft and labor violations in household employment. The resources available through philanthropic channels were vastly larger than what we could raise through community donations and membership fees. But the foundation work also reminded me daily of the power dynamics that shape domestic workers' lives. Here I was, sitting around a conference table with people who had made their wealth from investments and business ventures, directing money toward organizations that served women who cleaned their offices and cared for their children. The irony wasn't lost on me, and neither was the opportunity to influence how that money was distributed. I used my position to advocate for funding approaches that supported worker organizing rather than just service provision. Instead of funding programs that helped individual domestic workers escape bad situations, we prioritized organizations that were building collective power to change the structures that created those situations in the first place. Instead of funding scholarships that allowed a few workers to move into other professions, we funded campaigns that improved wages and working conditions for all domestic workers. The strategy was sometimes controversial among other board members who preferred more traditional charitable approaches. But over time, the evidence supported organizing-focused funding as more effective at creating sustainable change. You've taught us to think differently about impact. The Foundation's executive director told me after our second year of collaboration, we used to measure success by how many individual workers we helped. Now we measure success by how much we've changed the systems that created the problems in the first place. The shift in thinking wasn't just philosophical, it produced measurable results. The cities where we funded organizing efforts saw significant increases in domestic workers' wages, improvements in working conditions, and passage of local legislation that protected household employees' rights. The impact was broader and more lasting than what we achieved through individual services alone. Meanwhile, our organization in Puerto Rico had become a model for domestic worker organizing that was being replicated in other regions. We had developed training materials, legal toolkits, and organizing strategies that were being adapted by groups in the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and Central America. Carmen, now in her final year of engineering school, was designing an app that would help domestic workers track their hours, document wage theft, and connect with legal resources. "I want to use my technical skills to support the work you're doing," she told me as she showed me the app's prototype. "I want to build tools that make it easier for women to advocate for themselves." Watching my daughter apply her education to social justice work filled me with pride that had nothing to do with her academic achievements and everything to do with her values. She had grown up watching me transform from invisible service into visible advocacy, and she was choosing to use her own privileges and opportunities in service of women who reminded her of who her mother used to be. The app launch became a community celebration, with domestic workers from across the island coming to learn how to use the new tool and share their experiences with technology and organizing. Many of the women had never used smartphones for anything more complex than phone calls and texting, but they quickly mastered the app's features when they understood how it could protect them from wage theft and workplace violations. "This makes me feel powerful," said Isabella, a woman who had been caring for an elderly man with limited mobility. "I can show exactly how many hours I worked, exactly what tasks I performed. They can't lie about what I did or didn't do." The app also connected women with each other, creating networks of mutual support that extended beyond our weekly meetings in San Juan. Women in rural areas could connect with our resources and with each other, breaking the isolation that made exploitation easier and organizing more difficult. The technology complemented the human relationships we'd built, but it didn't replace them. The weekly support groups remain the heart of our work, the place where women processed their experiences, built their confidence, and developed the analysis that informed our policy advocacy. As our 7th anniversary approached, I found myself reflecting on what we'd accomplished and what challenges remained. We had helped hundreds of women recover stolen wages, improve their working conditions, and develop their capacity for leadership and advocacy. We'd influenced local and regional policies, contributed to national conversations about care work, and built networks that connected domestic workers across geographical and linguistic boundaries. But exploitation in domestic work continued, driven by global economic inequality, immigration policies that made workers vulnerable to abuse, and cultural attitudes that devalued reproductive labor. For every woman we helped, there were dozens more who remained isolated and invisible. The work was sustainable in ways it hadn't been in our early years. We had diversified funding sources, trained multiple generations of leadership, and built institutional knowledge that didn't depend on any individual advocate's continued involvement. But it remained emotionally demanding, requiring constant attention to our own needs and boundaries, while responding to urgent crises in other people's lives. I had learned to balance the advocacy work with personal relationships and activities that recharged my energy rather than depleting it. Antonio and I took monthly trips to different parts of the island, exploring beaches and mountains and small towns where no one knew about our work and we could simply enjoy each other's company. I had returned to reading for pleasure, cooking elaborate meals because I enjoyed the process rather than because anyone expected it, and tending my garden as a form of meditation rather than productivity. Carmen was planning to take a job with an engineering firm that specialized in sustainable infrastructure projects in rural communities. She would be able to stay in Puerto Rico while contributing to work that aligned with her values. Antonio was considering early retirement from construction to spend more time supporting the advocacy organization and developing the employer education workshops that had become his area of expertise. We were becoming a family that had built our lives around values rather than obligations, around mutual care rather than hierarchical service. On the evening of our anniversary celebration, as the community center gradually emptied and I cleaned up the remnants of our party, I thought about Mr. Harrington's letter to the private investigator that had started my journey toward visibility. He had wanted to know who Catherine really is when she thinks no one is watching. The question had revealed his own manipulation and deception, but it also highlighted something important about human relationships. Who we are when we think no one is watching is often who we really are. Not the performance we put on for others, but the values and priorities that guide our behavior when there are no external rewards or punishments. For 9 years in that Manhattan penthouse, I had cared for the Harrington family even when no one was watching, even when my kindness wasn't acknowledged or reciprocated. I had given genuine care because that was who I really was, not because I was being tested or evaluated, but but I had also disappeared into that care, forgetting that my own needs and dreams mattered. I had mistaken selflessness for virtue, invisibility for humility, exploitation for sacrifice. The woman I had become was still someone who cared deeply for others, but I now understood the difference between care that came from choice and care that came from obligation, between service that honored my values and service that required me to abandon my sense of self. Who Rosa Martinez really was when no one was watching was a woman who grew vegetables in her garden because she loved the process of nurturing growing things, who made elaborate meals for her family because she enjoyed the creativity and the conversations that happened around the dinner table, who advocated for domestic workers because she knew from experience what it felt like to be invisible and was committed to making sure other women didn't have to disappear in order to survive. Who she was when people were watching was the same person, but more confident, more vocal, more insistent on being seen and valued for who she was rather than for what she could provide. The transformation from invisible service to visible advocacy had taken years of internal work and external support. But it had been possible because I had been surrounded by people who saw my worth even when I couldn't see it myself. Carmen, who never stopped believing her mother deserved better. Antonio, who loved me without trying to fix or change me. Janet Torres, who fought for my legal rights when I didn't know I had any. Mrs. Chen, who reminded me that I was human during the years when I felt like furniture. The women in our support group who shared their stories and helped me understand mine. Individual transformation was never just individual. It happened in relationship with other people who reflected back our dignity when we had forgotten it ourselves. As I locked up the community center and walked to my car, I thought about the women who would come to next week's support group meeting, new faces mixed with familiar ones, stories I had heard before and stories that would surprise me. Each woman would be at a different point in her journey toward visibility, toward understanding her own worth, toward demanding the respect she deserved. Some would be ready to leave exploitative situations immediately. Others would need months or years of small changes before they felt safe making larger ones. All of them would need community, information, and the reminder that they were not alone in their experiences. The work would continue, carried forward by all of us together, each woman's individual healing contributing to the collective power we were building to change the systems that made invisibility seem necessary in the first place. I drove home through the familiar streets of San Juan, past the houses where I knew domestic workers were finishing their long days, past the wealthy neighborhoods where some of them lived in quarters too small and wages too low, past the community centers and churches where organizing meetings happened in the evenings and on weekends. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to turn individual pain into collective power. But tonight, I was Rosa Martinez driving home to a house where I belonged, to a family that loved me, to a life I had chosen rather than accepted. I was a woman who had learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between serving others and serving myself into disappearance. I was free, and I was not alone, and I was using my freedom to help other women find theirs. To all of you listening who have given yourselves away piece by piece, who have worked without recognition, who have cared without being cared for in return, I want you to know that your story isn't over. It's never too late to step out of the shadows and into your own life. It's never too late to demand more for yourself, to say no to what diminishes you and yes to what helps you grow. You are not a service. You provide a service. You are not invisible. You have simply been surrounded by people who chose not to see you. You are not lucky to have a roof over your head if that roof becomes a prison. You are worthy of appreciation, respect, and love, not because you earn it, but because you are human. I know it's scary to change, to risk everything you've built, even when what you've built isn't really yours. But I also know that the person you could become is worth more than the security of staying invisible. Tell me, have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever given so much of yourself away that you forgot who you were underneath all that service? Share your story in the comments below, not because you owe anyone your truth, but because sharing it might help you reclaim it. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach another woman who works with dedication and heart, but may have forgotten her own worth along the way. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving about finding your voice after years of silence. You can find it here by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. Remember, you matter. Your story matters. Your voice matters. I'll see you in the next story.